de Apollo 11 werd er nog 5 keer een bemande vlucht naar de maan gemaakt. De Apollo 13 slaagde er niet in de maan te bereiken. En de kans leek groot dat de 3 inzittende astronauten de reis niet zouden overleven. Tegen alle verwachtingen in is het drietal toch ongedeerd op aarde teruggekeerd.
Dot.
Roger, how does it look?
The Eagle has wings.
Roger. Roger, you're a go to continue power descent. You're a go to continue power descent.
We're really going to go. We're going to go to the surface of the moon. We're not only going to try to do it, we're going to accomplish the first landing of a human on another planet.
If the mission succeeds, we will no longer be destined to live out the ages here on Earth. We will have taken our first step toward the stars.
It seemed an impossibility. It seemed like such a risk, such a courageous, unbelievably courageous kind of thing to attempt.
Eagle, Houston, you're a go for landing, over.
Head 4 forward, drift into the right a little.
30 seconds. 30 seconds.
Forward, just contact light. Okay, engine stop. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
After a quiet lunch, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin prepare to step into an unknown world and take the most famous walk in human history.
I'm at the foot of the ladder. I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looked beautiful from here, Neil.
Man was on the moon. It is a watershed moment in history, and the world would never be the same again.
Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. And as you talk to us from the Sea of Tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to Earth. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one. One in their pride in what you have done, and one in our prayers that you will return safely to Earth.
60 miles above, Michael Collins in the command module circles every 2 hours and worries about stranding his companions on the moon.
Well, I enjoyed being in the command module by myself. It was a happy little home. All the machinery was working properly, and my concerns were not within the command module, but simply that something might go wrong with the LAM, with the lunar module, and these two guys might get stuck on the surface of the moon. That was my main concern.
Columbia, this is Houston, AOS, over.
Houston, Columbia on the high gain, over.
Roger, the EVA is progressing beautifully. I guess you're about the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage of the scene.
That's all right, I don't mind a bit. How is the quality of the TV?
Oh, it's beautiful, Mike, it really is.
Landing the Apollo spacecraft on the moon was one thing, but successfully achieving the second part of Kennedy's promise, bringing the astronauts home safely, was something else entirely.
there was an underlying concern on the part of everybody involved in the next major step, which was getting them home safely, getting them off the moon. The rockets again had to work now in reverse to explode them off the surface of the moon and back to the rendezvous, which had to be made with the circling Apollo.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, work stage, engine arm ascent, proceed. Shadow, beautiful. 26, 36 feet per second up. 5 for the pitch over. Very smooth.
It is now 12:55 p.m. Houston time. Eagle's ascent engine fires. The sighs of relief are almost loud enough to be heard over the 250,000 miles between the Earth and the Moon.
Eagle Houston, 1 minute, you're looking good. Roger.
Next is the rendezvous. NASA engineers have long considered this the greatest unknown of the entire mission.
The one that I mistrusted the most was the rendezvous part. That was the thing that was on my mind primarily, was bringing these two vehicles, bringing this ungainly-looking critter back up from the surface of the moon successfully.
The two spacecraft move closer and closer to one another. Finally, the latches engage, and the two spacecraft lock into place. The astronauts jettison the LEM and fire what Collins calls the Take Me Home burn.
Hello, Apollo 11, Houston, ready to go, over.
Open up the LRL doors, Charlie.
Roger, we got you coming home. It's well stocked.
Velocity 33,000 feet per second. 35,000 feet per second now.
Apollo 11 is getting closer and closer to home. Shortly past noon, the spacecraft crosses an imaginary line and enters the Earth's sphere of influence.
Apollo 11, Houston, with a little recovery force information, over.
The recovery ship, the carrier USS Hornet, is picking up thunderstorms on radar. Weather conditions at the splashdown coordinates are becoming worse.
Roger, the Hornet is on station, just far enough off the target point to keep from getting hit.
Hornet reports sonic boom a short time ago.
Apollo 11 streaks over the Solomon Islands. G-forces reach 6.3, and the drogue chute deploys.
Apollo 11, this is Hornet, over. Apollo 11, reach the last clear.
The space capsule was at 1,500 feet, 1,500, splashdown. A tiny vessel home from the moon. They have done the impossible.
Well, the most interesting part from a recovery operation on Apollo 11 were the tremendous precautions that we had to take associated with the possibility of bringing lunar pathogens back into the Earth's atmosphere and the seas and so forth. There was a great fear, but it was an unknown. It was an unknown of what was the possibility of bringing something back that would be greatly harmful to the Earth.
You're told you have to conduct a quarantine. So I am now faced with medically conducting a quarantine, which means that I have to take every means possible to preclude some organism that I don't know. I don't know what this organism is. Nobody knows what the organism is. So what measures do I use to contain that organism? That was a very bad spot to be in.
Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins are placed in a quarantine facility, not unlike a small mobile trailer. The astronauts and the lunar materials are to be isolated for 21 days, while exhaustive medical and scientific tests are conducted.
We found no bad effect on animal, plant, or human from the lunar material. The only effect we saw was that it made some of the plants grow better. You could grow lettuce about twice as fast and some of the things like that, but other than that, we saw no effect.
Shortly after we took a shower and relaxed inside on the aircraft carrier, we were asked if we wanted to look at some of the television tapes that were taken while our flight was in progress and while we were landing. And as I saw this, the thought popped into my mind, and I said to Neil, look, we missed the whole thing. Now, what I really meant by that was that what was happening was not up there where we were, it was happening back here. And I'm reflecting a little bit with hindsight, but the significance of Apollo is what happened in the hearts and minds of people all over the earth.
The Apollo 11 mission was over. The promise President Kennedy made to the world had been fulfilled. The torch was now ready to be passed. For this was only the beginning of our exploration into the unknown world of space. On November 18, 1969, under the command of Pete Conrad, Apollo 12 would land in the ocean of storms. During their stay on the lunar surface, Conrad and fellow crew member Alan Bean took 2 moonwalks lasting just under 4 hours each. Next was Apollo 13. It blasted off at 13 hours, 13 minutes Central Time on April 11, 1970. 2 days later, on April 13th, while preparing to orbit the moon, Jim Lovell and his Apollo 13 crew suffer a mid-space explosion of an oxygen tank in the command module.
Houston, we've had a problem here.
Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
Stand by, 13. We're looking at it.
In the hours immediately after the explosion, I think most people would have felt that they were doomed. I mean, how in the world were we going to get them back?
Okay, now let's everybody keep cool. We got the LEM still attached. The LEM spacecraft's good, so if we need to get back home, we got a LEM to do a good portion of it with.
Fortunately, the explosion occurred at a very opportune time, which I didn't realize at the time. But we had the lunar module attached to it, to the command module, and so we all climbed into the lunar module to use it as a lifeboat and use the engine to maneuver the combination vehicles around to get it back on the proper trajectory to get home. It was very difficult to fly because here we had this dead command module attached to the lunar module, the lunar module was never designed to fly with this big weight on one end, or big mass, I should say, and consequently, it was a learning curve all the way home. Minute by minute and hour by hour, the men in Mission Control, with help from all over the country, began to piece together a plan which kept them alive a little bit longer and a little bit longer, and each minute, each hour allowed more options to be brought into play.
Well, here we had an explosion, and due to the ingenuity of the people on board and the people on the ground, using the lunar module as a lifeboat, I mean, that was incredible sort of stuff.
Odyssey Houston, standing by, over.
Okay, go.
Odyssey Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great.
Apollo 14 would give Alan Shepard, the first American ever to go into space, his opportunity to walk and play golf on the lunar surface.
Well, I got to admit, going to the moon is pretty exciting. There's no question about it. When I look up at the moon, I can see the spot under the moon's right eye where I landed, and think about playing golf up there. So far, I'm the only guy to do that.
It just so happens to have a genuine 6-iron on the bottom of it. In my left hand, I have a little white pellet that's a million and millions of Americans. Drop it down. Unfortunately, the suit is so stiff I can't do this with 2 hands, but I'm going to try a little sand trap shot here. That looked like a slice to me, Al.
I really wasn't at the gee whiz stage until after we'd landed. We got out, walked around a little bit, got all of our tools set, and then we had the chance to look back at the Earth without any spacecraft in the way, up in the black sky, to look at a planet which is 4 times the size of the moon and has color. I mean, we're living color. You can see the white ice caps and the blue oceans, and it's just a remarkable view. There's just no question about it. I was emotionally shaken. I just actually wept at the thought of such a beautiful planet was home, and that's where all of our friends were.
The astronauts of Apollo 15, 16, and 17 would drive moon rovers across the lunar surface to explore and collect more of the treasures that were hidden on the moon.
Well, I can see I'm going to have to keep my eye on the road. Boy, it's really rolling hills, Joe. Just like 14. Up and down we go. It feels like we need the seatbelts, doesn't it, Jim? Yeah, really do.
They collected samples of lunar material as well as conducted a variety of scientific experiments that would increase our knowledge, not only about the moon, but our own Earth as well.
Well, Tony, that's your house rock right there. Very good. Don't get too near the edge of that thing. It falls off. Look over at your right. It falls off pretty good. Yeah, I know.
It seemed, at least for the moment, that we were in the midst of the golden age of space exploration. Then, something happened. The Apollo lunar missions ended. Apollo 17 astronaut Jack Schmitt was the first geologist and one of the last 2 men to set foot on the surface of the moon.
My last view of the moon out of the right-hand window of the Lunar Module Challenger was one of the black sky and these brilliantly illuminated mountains off to the west. It was a view that both exhilarated me because I knew we had done a good job. We had done everything we'd planned to do, as well as everything that we had hoped to do while we were in the valley. But there was a sense of sadness as well. That sadness came because of the knowledge by that time that we were going to be the last Apollo mission to the moon.
We hope that this will be a symbol of what our feelings are, what the feelings of the Apollo program are, and a symbol of mankind that we can live in peace and harmony in the future. 99, proceeded, 3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector good. Ag thought.
12 men walked on the surface of the moon. These were watershed moments in the history of man. But the question was asked then, as it is today, what did we learn from Apollo? Was landing men on the moon and bringing lunar samples back to Earth worth the cost, let alone the risk?
First thing we learned was that we can actually go to the moon, and we can do it routinely. And that's a deep fact in everybody's conscience now.
One of the important pieces of information we got were the ages of the rocks, and we were able to understand in a geological time scale how old the surface of the moon was, because there was a great debate before we went. And we found out, much to our surprise, that the surface of the moon was very ancient, dating back to most of the history of the solar system.
That's the other thing we got out of Apollo. We found out how it formed, I think. Most people now think that a very large impact, one of these early wanderers in the solar system, struck the Earth soon after the Earth formed and threw off ejecta, vapor, and so forth into the Earth orbit that reaccumulated as the moon.
Careful scientific analysis of the lunar soil has revealed the presence of an isotope called helium-3, an energy resource that many think could replace the diminishing reserves of fossil fuels on Earth.
Helium-3 as a fuel infusion power plant produces essentially no significant environmental consequences. The only thing we don't have here on Earth is a ready supply of helium-3. The moon offers us that ready supply.
But scientific discovery wasn't the only benefit to be gained from Apollo. For many, it provided a new perspective of ourselves and our planet Earth.
I think when we first went to the moon, we didn't know what we would learn. The most important thing we ended up learning, in my view, is more about ourselves. We turned around and we looked back, and we saw that blue marble.
The Earth does appear fragile from space. Atmosphere is not apparent. It shines. It bounces the sunlight very well. So you have this very small, very shiny spherical object, and somehow it just appears to me, at least, extremely fragile.
I think it's of considerable significance that the icon of the environmental movement is a photograph of Earth from space. Space changed our perception of this entire planet. For the first time, we saw the planet whole. You might even say that this photograph of Earth from space in many ways was perhaps the greatest single contribution to date of the space age.
There was a tremendous thing that came to some astronauts that was really a transformation. It said, wow, the Earth is an integral, interconnected part of the universe, and you don't see boundaries when you get out here and look at this thing.
One of the most important things we learn from space is about ourselves. We live on a planet which is teeming with life, but it's not independent. We don't really know ourselves very well. We don't know the planet we live on, the life forms we depend on. And one of the things that I think is most important to future generations is that with this opportunity of looking at ourselves in space, we're going to come to know ourselves.
Some said that the age-old dream of flight was now fulfilled, that man had traveled up from Earth and out toward the stars, that he had ventured forth and explored a world beyond his own. But like all the dreams conceived in the minds of men, there can be no end to the creations of the imagination. Once a dream comes true, there will always be new visions and challenges to replace those of our past. And so it is with our dreams of flight. Even with the Apollo lunar missions over, mankind's quest toward the outer reaches of the universe was only just beginning. First, there was Skylab, America's first experiment of living and working high above the Earth. Then came Apollo-Soyuz, mankind's great handshake in space. That was soon followed by the maiden voyage of the space shuttle Columbia, as well as unmanned probes that journeyed into the depths of our solar system and beyond. These were adventures that provided the dreamers with more and more knowledge and insight about those worlds yet to be discovered high in the night sky, and convinced them once again that the dream lives on, the dream endures.
Ook na de vlucht van de Apollo 17, die de laatste landing op de maan maakte, ontwikkelde de lucht- en ruimtevaart zich verder. In de aflevering van de historie van de luchtvaart donderdag onder meer aandacht voor Skylab, het eerste ruimtevaartlaboratorium in de ruimte. En voor de Space Shuttle, om 3 uur bij EUR7.